Stanford University. He has been chair of his department, chair of the university committee, and has had multiple other appointments and also recipient of multiple awards and honors here on campus. He's a great friend of Lassie's and also a member of our steering committee. Professor Gustavo Gordillo, he's a current Tinker visiting professor. He has a doctorate of the third cycle and other degrees from La Sorbonne in Paris, France. And he held important posts in the ministries of agriculture and agrarian reform in Mexico. He was director of rural development and agrarian reform for FAO in Rome, and also a regional representative for FAO for Latin America in Santiago, Chile. And he teaches at the National University in Mexico and other universities. So we welcome our speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. And thanks to Lassie's for allowing us to have Gustavo here this semester. It's been a gift to for many of our students on campus, especially in agricultural and applied economics, where he's been housed. He ran a great seminar this semester on agrarian reform in Mexico, and we've reflected on agrarian reform elsewhere. And Gustavo's also a tremendous mentor. He's taken on several students in the time he's here, and their careers are, I think, going to be advanced by that mentorship. So I'm very grateful, again, to Lassie's and to Gustavo. So today, Gustavo and I will discuss our individual and shared efforts to try to understand how social and agrarian policy might be linked to improve rural productivity. And really by that, we're also talking about rural poverty, how to help with smallholder agriculture in Latin America and elsewhere to advance the ways in which both social policy and agrarian policy could be used to improve the lives of rural people and especially the rural poor. Now, what's exciting about today's talk, I think, is the tremendous breadth of experience that Gustavo brings, and I guess me too, on these issues. So we're going to try to keep our talk relatively short to allow there to be time for discussion. And I also want to say that this is not like a formal paper in the sense that we've completed an analysis that we're presenting our work on. It's more reflective and integrative of our work and some other people's work to give a kind of state of what we know on this question. So that's the kind of the way in which the talk will be organized. So maybe the first point is to understand is that both social and agrarian policies are alive and well. And by alive and well, I mean they're in play. And it's easy to forget about the agrarian policy side. For those who work on international development issues, we pretty much know that the social policy side with respect to these conditional cash transfers, as they're called, these transfers of money on a regular basis to poor families, is quite pervasive now. And when I say they're alive and well, I guess what I also want to argue is I don't think either of these policies are going away anytime soon. So thinking about how to integrate them and make them productive in a way that reinforces in a positive manner their impacts is a really important topic. Now, we've learned something about these issues, and so that will be the kind of the focus of our talk. We've learned something on both the agrarian policy side and on the social policy side in terms of what types of impacts they have. But really the question we have today is whether, we can kind of have it all. Can we have the kind of healthier, better educated, better fed children that comes along with the approach of social policy at the same time that we're linking that to improving the productivity of the households that those children are residing in, and potentially improving the labor outcomes associated with the families and the children and the subsequent generations. So this is a question that international development organizations and national governments are thinking hard about. And so in today's talk, what we'll do first is Gustavo will follow my little introduction here with a discussion of what we call the Latin American paradox. And then I will describe the conditional cash transfer programs in Mexico and Brazil and say something about what we know about their impacts. There's been a lot of evaluations done of them, especially of the Oportunidades program in Mexico. And so we'll take a look at that, and we'll tie in a little bit about Procampo, which has been the major agrarian policy program that's been pursued throughout Mexico. So the kind of middle of the talk will be kind of what do we know, and then we'll come back around to considering what the next generation of these policies might look like. So Gustavo, it's all yours.
Thanks. So I'm very happy to be again here. I was here in October and I presented a little bit on agrarian reform processes in Mexico. So now I'm going to speak about something that Professor Alain de Janvry from the University of Berkeley, while doing the World Development Report 2008, denominated the Latin American paradox. And basically the idea is, normally you believe that if you have strong growth in agriculture, you will have an impact in reducing poverty. And that's more or less what people know of different places. But in Latin America, you have three problems. Agricultural growth is not poor, even in countries with strong economic growth and strong poverty reduction, such as Brazil and Chile. Secondly, you have structural inequalities, which explain very much the meager contribution of agricultural growth to poverty reduction. And very importantly, you have a very regressive public expenditure in agriculture. Those are findings that you can see in the 2008 World Development Report. It was a report that was done by an incredible amount of experts in different parts of Latin America and North America and Europe and so on. And basically, there is two data that I want to present here. One is the contribution of rural sector to aggregated poverty change from 1903 to 2002. As we know, the success story is actually China, very much, and it continues to be very much China. And still, you have other regions, India and Europe and Central Asia, which have important reductions during that period. But the Latin American case is interesting because you don't have a reduction, you have a little increase. Now, when you analyze the contribution of rural sector to aggregate poverty change, what you find is basically, if you take out migration, the impact on the side of the rural sector is negative. If you take migration into consideration, then you have a very strong impact. Not the strongest of all, but you have India, which has also a very strong migrant part and also a very strong poverty-neutral migration impact of a rural sector. So then, clearly, Latin America is an outlier. And the question, and then you have this other part, the productivity gaps between sizes of farmlands are very lagging in the small farm sector. Now you want to discuss why does this happen, and basically they found two ideas. One is growth linked to activities that generate little employment and low wage employment in the rural sector. No? The case, the very clear case is soybean cultivation. You have very strong areas of soybean in Brazil and in Argentina, and their impact in terms of employment is really very low. And secondly, crucially, public expenditures are very regressive because of the strong corporate agricultural lobbies. And this is something that exists everywhere, not only in Latin America, but it is crucially important in the case of Latin America. So from that, a group of experts in Latin America, agriculture and development studies decided that we should take as a point of reference the Latin American paradox that was presented in the 2008 World Development Report and present a new study more in depth on why was those things happening. So this is a report of an independent panel. It's in Spanish, unfortunately, only, but it's published by Editorial Teseo. Whoever wants to see that text, you can bring it, download it from the internet. And this is the group of persons who participated in this review. So what do we conclude? We analyzed it from different perspectives, the productivity side, the social side, the governance side, etc., the sustainable development impacts and so on. And what we got basically is this conclusion. There's a triple failure of governance. First, agri-policy is an ensemble of fragmented policies based on particular specific non-public negotiations. So what you have basically in all Latin American countries, this is with no exception. When I was regional representative of FAO for Latin America and the Caribbean, I was in constant contact during the 7 years I was there with the 33 countries that were part of the Latin American group. So I really saw that firsthand. There are an incredible fragmented policies in different areas. So you have a coordination failure. That's the first thing you have. Secondly, you have strong coalitions. You can sit down over here, guys. Huh? You have very exclusionary coalitions, strong but exclusionary. Exclusionary in what sense? Well, basically in the sense that they don't include basically small farmers. And this is one of the most important things. And then you are confronting a situation where there is a clear case of political negotiations rather than only technical negotiations. So our point of view is that it's not enough to say you need to have certain technical responses to try to solve the basic question, which is how can you have an agricultural growth that impacts poverty? And that is not a technical, you don't have a technical answer only. You need to analyze also the political conditions and what coalition could do that. And in order to analyze which alternative coalition could help on that, well, you have to see who are the players now. And this is the very important thing. You have an incredible plurality of players who have a role, and sometimes a crucial role, in terms of rural development and agrarian development. First, ministries. Sometimes the Ministry of Agriculture is the less equipped and the less powerful of the ministries. Sometimes the Ministry of Trade and on Finance have a much more saying and have the money to do that and to define the agricultural policy. Then you have the role of the executive branch and the legislative branch. In Latin America, we have had traditionally a presidential system in which the legislative branch has played a very small role normally until the past 10, 12 years when most of the countries in Latin America made a transition from authoritarian regimes to democratic regimes, and now legislative branch plays an important role. So then it's an actor that was not considered before, and now it's considered. Then you have corporate actors, and very importantly, supermarkets. Walmart and Carrefour are very important. Once we had a discussion with ministers of agriculture from Latin America. We were having dinner. At some point, we were in a closed room. No, there were no press and so on. So one minister told me, what would you think is the best thing we should do with the ministries of agriculture in Latin America? And I said, disappear them, because they have no really role. Markets are the new, supermarkets are the new ministries of agriculture in many respects because of the impact they play in terms of production. Do you want to have that? Obviously not. You want to have a difference between what would be public policy and what is private policy, but that's the situation now. Then you have also farmers' associations who have a role. Some are very strong in some countries. For example, farmers' associations are very strong in Brazil. They're not as strong in Mexico. They're not as strong in Chile, but they're very, very, very strong in Argentina, especially the big farmers there. Then you have national NGOs and international NGOs. In some countries, especially in Africa, I would say the Gates Foundation is more important in terms of defining sometimes social and rural policy than the governments. Again, this is something, from my perspective, actually, you would not want to have. You want to have governments that are responsible and that are accountable for the people who elect them. But obviously, you want to have strong civil society as well. Then you have multilateral organizations from FAO and IFAD to the World Bank and IMF, which also play an important role. And very importantly, you have a passive investor, the urban population. What we have found, even in countries who are strongly agricultural based, which is very few in Latin America. Most of Latin American countries, in terms of what is the impact, the contribution of agriculture to the GDP, with some exceptions in Central America, in some parts of the Caribbean, and probably Bolivia. Now the mining area is much more important, but in most countries you have countries who are transitioning from an agricultural-based economy to a much more urban and service basis. That's absolutely the case in Mexico, and that's very much similarly the case in Colombia and other parts. Nevertheless, you do have an agricultural sector that's very important. My point is, whatever coalition you want to make in order to change the direction of agricultural policy, you need to have urban people involved. It's part of the coalition as consumers, as some people who are responsible and are importantly feeling the effects of environmental issues as well. So then you need to have that coalition in place. So based on that and these ideas, then we now go to the specific issue of cash transfers, and Brad is going to continue on this.
Thank you, Gustavo. So one way of thinking about where we are in the conversation is that we've just had a very quick but incisive overview of agrarian policy and the kind of challenges it faces. It faces the challenge of this kind of productivity growth and also the problems of poverty, and rural producers being the ones, especially small-scale producers, being the ones that are struggling to improve their productivity. So where the conditional cash transfer kind of story comes in is, first of all, as a social policy, it is now the most pervasive social policy effort in Latin America and throughout most of the world in terms of a direct effort to reduce poverty. And what it consists of is a monthly direct cash transfer, usually to mothers, not always. Certainly in a single-headed family with a father, the father would get it. And in most of these programs, it's conditional on children attending school, and then the mothers or the parents attending programs related to nutrition and health. So these programs, they allow for basically about somewhere between, let's say, $10 and $30 a month going to a family for one child, and sometimes up to $100 a month for families with 3 or 4 children. Usually they're capped at some level so they don't encourage families to just keep having children to get more transfers. And as the amounts vary, what doesn't vary is the emphasis on school attendance, and then the variation that does occur with school attendance is whether they're emphasizing primary or secondary. In many of the programs now, it's only actually support for secondary school enrollment. That would be like in Argentina and Chile, where these programs are oriented, around a country where education at the primary level is pretty much universal. So if you're going to make a difference in terms of schooling impact, it's going to be by assisting at the secondary or even high school level. Now, eligibility is usually based on the some sort of spatial and economic targeting. So they usually will say, okay, maybe in this particular rural area, we're going to say every household in this village is likely to be eligible, but households in this municipality, we're going to have some kind of income threshold. So there's often both spatial and economic targeting of the population. The criteria is variable across rural and urban areas, but it's aimed at and does a pretty good job in most places of getting primarily to the poor. One of the reasons these programs are so popular, another reason they're popular, is that there's relatively little what economists and other development policy people call leakage. Because, think of a program when you give to a charity, you're worried about whether a dime out of the dollar you're going to give is going to go to, the recipients in need, or 90 cents on the dollar, right? You would favor, if you were giving $1, you'd like to know that all of it's going in. Sometimes when you see a charitable appeal, they'll tell you 95 cents out of $1 gets to such and such. Well, these programs hit around 90% usually, so they can be less, but that's a lot more, a lot higher, targeting success than many programs where the leakage might be half or more. So the goals of these programs, as you can see, are multiple. In the short run, they're aimed at alleviating poverty. At the long run, they're aimed at trying to break what they call the intergenerational cycle of poverty. The notion being if kids get more education and are in better health, then they're going to be able to do better either in the labor market or in their own kind of business activity. Also improving the health and well-being of mothers and children. That obviously aids both short and long-term poverty goals. But oftentimes people also think about them as a way that can be used to assist with other kinds of family investments, and I'll come back to that. And that's where the link to the rural and agrarian policies may come into play. I want to give you just a little bit more history on these conditional cash transfers. They started in Mexico in 1996 and in Brazil in 1997 under slightly different names than they have now. And in both countries, I think they would be viewed as the leading edge of social policy, anti-poverty programs. And they were pretty popular at the time of introduction, even in the multilateral institutions in the era of the Washington Consensus, because I think they were viewed as sort of non-interventionary in terms of property rights and other kinds of things that the multilateral agencies were promoting, but they were a direct transfer that could begin to break the cycle from the same organization's perspective, break the cycle of poverty that many both rural and urban families face. So they spread throughout the region. There are now present in about something like 20 Latin American countries. I don't know the exact number around the world, but it would be something probably like 50 or 60, especially if you counted places where they've taken out the conditionality. So one of the next generation policies of this is they just give the transfer and they don't necessarily say, okay, make sure the kid's attending school. And in any case, in Latin America, Brazil now has 13 million households, Mexico 6 million households. And if you were to do sort of a population rate, it's probably about 20 to 25% of Latin American households that are receiving a conditional cash transfer. Okay, so that is a pervasive social policy. And I'd like to point out that I think it's also persistent. They're very popular. Once they're in place, you don't want to be known as a politician who said, oh, I'm going to take that away from you. Because you're taking away a program that's probably serving, 20, 25% of the population. Probably your party's not likely to get reelected the next time around if that population has anything to say about it. So it's likely to stick around, and that makes it part of what makes it as interesting as it is for thinking about what we would like to know about how it could impact rural productivity and rural poverty. Okay, so there are other organizations trying to think about how to link these two. The FAO is one, but others are in place. So let me then turn towards thinking about, well, what might we imagine if we take kind of a across the spectrum view of how these conditional cash transfers might affect rural welfare. They might affect human capital, which was their original design, in terms of early childhood development, schooling, the health and well-being of the family. But they could also impact rural enterprise productivity. How could they do that? Well, one of the primary ways is by providing a regular monthly transfer to the family. They may serve as a basis for reducing what economists call liquidity or financing constraints. If I want to undertake an economic activity, some kind of investment, having a regular flow of money I can count on, which can help to finance that or help to leverage a loan or help to leverage some kind of transfer to the household from other people that would finance that investment, this could be very helpful for both agriculture and non-agricultural activities. Another concern that economists have is that even if people have access to finance for an investment, they may be concerned about the risk they face when they undertake an activity. So if I'm going to invest, let's say, in an orchard or some kind of a longer-term investment that could raise the productivity of my land, maybe improve the pasture, buy some livestock, if I don't have some kind of insurance against the risk associated with that activity, I might be less likely to undertake it. And again, these kind of monthly transfers can be viewed as a regular payment that can buffer a household in a time of shock. And finally, of course, anytime you have more income, you have the potential to increase your savings and your investment. A link that people think a little bit less about is what it might mean for labor earnings. Originally, when these programs were designed, people thought about them, I think, in the way that economists often viewed anti-poverty programs in the U.S. If you give people a transfer, then they won't work. But that may not be the case here. And first of all, with respect to labor earnings, you may have a situation where you can finance the migration of somebody in the household in the same way I was just talking about with respect to some other investment. Imagine the following. I go to the village moneylender and I say, well, now I have this regular transfer coming in my way. Will you loan me $500 so I can send Jose, to the city or to the United States from Mexico to work there? and the money lender might say, yeah, now that I know you have $80 a month coming in on a regular basis, I anticipate you can pay it back. And so it can help to finance migration. It can also help to finance the training and education of youth to improve jobs. Indeed, that's its purpose, but it could be used for the older children, not just the younger children in that regard. And I won't have time to elaborate on it much, but think about how it might also strengthen the role of women in the household. If the woman is receiving the transfer, she has a little bit more bargaining power now in the household because of that, then she may be a little bit more confident that if she gets a job or earns some money, that money stays in her hands. And that might induce, in fact, a positive labor supply response rather than a negative one, because the shift in the bargaining power, the shift in the control over income could have that kind of effect. Okay, so complicated diagram. I'm not going to walk through it except to say the FAO, the International Food Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, is thinking about this issue. Here's agricultural programs. Here's social protection programs, feeding into the rural household, feeding into their consumption and production decisions. Here I'm just rehearsing what I said a couple minutes ago. Credit, maybe access to technology. People could change their behaviors. And when you go through the whole diagram, actually what you find is a lot of the stuff I just talked about, but they don't say much about what I call mobility or the labor migration aspect of it. They do talk about labor allocation, so they may mean that there, but the word migration doesn't show, and so that's an interesting kind of perhaps gap in their perspective. Otherwise, very comprehensive view. So what do we know? I'll do this in 5 minutes. What do we know about rural enterprise productivity links from these conditional cash transfer programs? Well, we know quite a bit at certain levels, because when the Mexico program was set up, originally as Progresa, now as Oportunidades, they set up an evaluation scheme that involved both what we would call a control group that didn't get the program right away, and a treatment group, one who did, and then they tracked those groups, and then they brought new communities and places online to the program over time. So you can use the gaps between when some people got it and other people didn't as a way to trace the impacts, if you can basically make the argument that the households that got it and didn't get it at the time that the program was started were otherwise identical. And that's the kind of methodology that gets used to pursue this. So there's a nice paper by Gertler and some colleagues, which does this for the agricultural side, looking at first a 1 year and then a 6 year kind of perspective on rural households in Mexico. And they find positive impacts of the access to the conditional cash transfers on investment, on agricultural production, and on long-term earnings for the household, such that over a 5 year period, it probably makes about a 50% difference in the earnings of these households, whether they were in the program or out of the program. That paper talks a lot about the implications of that for welfare, but they don't get very far on the causes of that because of the nature in which the analysis is done. But they speculate that it could be because households can now take on liquidity. They have liquidity they need, they can take on the risks they might not have taken on otherwise. But overall, they show quite significant impacts. The second study I want to bring to your attention, one by Todd and colleagues, is one that looks at the impacts of both Oportunidades and the major agrarian policy that's been pursued throughout Mexico, Pro Campo. And they get similar results to Gertler and his colleagues, that the productivity impacts are significant from Oportunidades, and they find for allowing us to have Gustavo here this semester. It's been a gift to for many of our students on campus, especially in agricultural and applied economics, where he's been housed. He ran a great seminar this semester on agrarian reform in Mexico, and we reflected on agrarian reform elsewhere. And Gustavo is also a tremendous mentor. He's taken on several students in the time he's here, and their careers are, I think, going to be advanced by that mentorship. So I'm very grateful, again, to Lassi's and to Gustavo. So today, Gustavo and I will discuss our individual and shared efforts to try to understand
going on to revitalize downtown Havana, Cuba. And next week, our lunchtime lecture in the same room, same time, is being presented by Norm Stockwell from Wart Radio, and he's going to talk about a book that was recently published called Rebel Reporting, that's sort of the life of John Ross. I don't know where I got that. John Ross, excuse me. That's next week at noon. So I'll turn it over to Alberto to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. I'm Alberto Vargas. I'm the Associate Director of the program, department. Has a PhD from Stanford University. He has been chair of his department, chair of the university committee, and has had multiple other appointments and also recipient of multiple awards and honors here on campus. He's a great friend of Lassis and also a member of our steering committee. Professor Gustavo Gordillo, he's a current Tinker visiting professor. He has a doctorate of the third cycle and other.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Ripp. I'm the outreach coordinator and undergrad advisor for the Latin American, Caribbean, and New Studies program. And thank you for coming this afternoon. As you probably noticed in the back, we have hot tea and coffee and snacks, which you're welcome to. We also have some handouts for some other upcoming lectures you might be interested in. As we're coming to the end of the semester, we have just a few left, so hopefully you can join us. Tomorrow we are sponsoring a talk in 260 Bascom at noon. It's called The Future of Havana, and it's about an urban planning project.
Degrees from La Sorbonne in Paris, France, and he held important posts in the ministries of agriculture and agrarian reform in Mexico. He was director of rural development and agrarian reform for FAO in Rome, and also a regional representative for FAO for Latin America in Santiago, Chile. And he teaches at the National University in Mexico and other universities. So we welcome our speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. And thanks, Lassi.